Ambassador Sarah Chen adjusted her simple black suit one final time before stepping off the human transport vessel. The massive docking bay of the Galactic Council station stretched before her like a metallic cathedral, filled with beings she had only seen in briefing videos. Towering crystalline entities from Zerion floated nearby, their bodies refracting light into rainbow patterns. 6 armed traders from the Keth Collective barked orders in their harsh language while loading cargo containers that seemed to weigh nothing in their powerful grip. Sarah's small delegation of 12 humans looked painfully ordinary among the exotic alien species. No extra limbs, no energy manipulation abilities, no natural armor or weapons, just standard-issue diplomatic uniforms and nervous expressions. The other species barely glanced their way as they made their way through the bustling station. The invitation had arrived 3 months ago, delivered by a Galactic Council courier who seemed barely able to contain his amusement. Earth would be granted observer status at the annual Dominion Selection Conference, where the most powerful civilizations would compete for territorial rights to newly discovered sectors of space. The human delegation would be allowed to watch the proceedings and even submit a formal application if they wished. The catch was obvious to everyone involved. Humanity had been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries. Their fastest ships took months to travel distances other species covered in days. Their military consisted of kinetic weapons and basic energy shields that were laughably primitive compared to matter disruptors and quantum barriers. The invitation was clearly meant as entertainment for the established powers. Sarah had read the files on their competitors during the long journey to the station. The Vorthak Empire controlled over 3,000 star systems through a combination of overwhelming military might and political cunning. Their battleships were said to be the size of small moons, equipped with weapons that could crack planets. The ethereal collective possessed technology that bordered on magic, able to manipulate space-time itself to achieve faster-than-light travel that made human warp drives look like primitive steam engines. The Zephyrian Trade Federation had economic power that spanned half the galaxy, capable of buying and selling entire worlds on a whim. And then there was humanity. Population of 12 billion spread across 15 colonies, a fleet of perhaps 500 ships, most of them converted cargo vessels with bolt-on weapon systems. No exotic technology, no ancient wisdom, no vast mineral wealth. They were the new kids in a neighborhood full of ancient titans. The delegation was escorted through corridors lined with what appeared to be living metal, walls that shifted and flowed like mercury while maintaining their structural integrity. Gravity plates beneath their feet adjusted automatically to accommodate the different physiologies of passing aliens. The technology on display was so advanced that Sarah felt like a cave dweller visiting a modern city. Their quarters were comfortable but clearly designed for the cheapest level of accommodations. The rooms were small, the furniture basic, and the view looked out onto the station's waste processing facilities rather than the spectacular nebula that dominated the local sky. The message was clear. Humans were here on sufferance, barely worthy of the most basic courtesy. The other delegations made no effort to hide their amusement. During the welcome reception, Sarah watched as ambassadors from major civilizations gathered in exclusive clusters, their conversations punctuated by the occasional glance toward the human delegation, followed by what could only be described as snickering. The Vorthak ambassador, a massive reptilian creature whose scales seemed to absorb light, made a point of walking past the humans while making comments in his own language that caused his entourage to erupt in harsh laughter. Commander Torres, the military attaché in Sarah's delegation, kept his expression carefully neutral, but she could see the anger building behind his eyes. "They think we're a joke," he muttered quietly during a brief moment when they were alone. "Let them," Sarah replied, watching as a group of ethereal representatives demonstrated their ability to phase through solid matter for the entertainment of lesser species. Underestimation has always been humanity's secret weapon. The formal proceedings began the following morning in a vast amphitheater that could accommodate thousands of beings. The chamber's walls were transparent, offering a breathtaking view of space beyond, where the fleets of various civilizations hung in formation like mechanical constellations. Each major power had brought impressive displays of their military might. The Vorthak fleet consisted of massive dreadnoughts that bristled with weapon arrays. The ethereal vessels seemed to shift and blur, existing partially outside normal space. The Zephyrian ships were works of art, their hulls gleaming with precious metals and exotic alloys. The human fleet, by comparison, looked like a collection of industrial equipment. Their ships were functional, utilitarian, and completely unremarkable. Sarah had overheard one alien diplomat describe them as charmingly primitive in the Universal Translator's dry monotone. The competition itself was elaborate theater. Each civilization would present their case for why they deserved control over the Kepler sector, a region of space containing 17 inhabitable worlds and significant mineral resources. The presentations were expected to showcase not just military capability, but technological advancement, economic power, and administrative competence. The Vorthak went first, their ambassador's presentation featuring holographic displays of their conquest fleets in action. Planets burning under orbital bombardment, enemy ships disintegrated by weapons that seemed to tear holes in space itself. Their message was simple: oppose us and be destroyed. The assembled representatives applauded politely, though Sarah noticed several smaller delegations exchanging worried glances. The ethereal collective's presentation was more subtle, but equally impressive. They demonstrated technology that defied conventional physics, ships that could exist in multiple locations simultaneously, weapons that attacked targets through parallel dimensions, defensive systems that made their vessels effectively untouchable. They spoke of bringing order to chaos, of guiding lesser species toward enlightenment through their superior wisdom. The Zephyrian presentation focused on economic development and trade opportunities. They showed detailed projections of how the Kepler sector could be transformed into a hub of galactic commerce, bringing prosperity to all involved parties. Their trade routes spanned the galaxy, their economic influence touching every major civilization. They had the resources to develop the sector quickly and efficiently. When humanity's turn came, the amphitheater fell into an expectant hush. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the entertainment portion of the proceedings. Sarah walked to the presentation platform with calm confidence, her small team arranging their simple equipment with practiced efficiency. "Honored representatives," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "Humanity comes before you today not as conquerors or enlightened beings or economic powerhouses. We come as builders." The presentation that followed was unlike anything the assembled aliens had expected. Instead of displays of military might or technological superiority, the humans showed images of their colonies. Not the gleaming capitals or impressive industrial complexes, but the communities. Schools where human children learned alongside alien refugees. Hospitals where human doctors treated patients from dozens of different species without regard for their ability to pay. Research facilities where human scientists worked collaborative projects with anyone willing to share knowledge. Sarah showed them footage from the Titan incident 5 years earlier. A mining colony had suffered a catastrophic life support failure that left 12,000 beings of various species trapped underground. The Galactic Council had declared the situation hopeless. The rescue would require technology and resources that simply weren't available in time. Humanity had disagreed. The human response fleet had been assembled in 18 hours from whatever ships were available. Cargo haulers, passenger transports, even privately owned vessels had been pressed into service. They had no advanced technology, no miraculous devices that could solve the problem easily. What they had was determination and an absolute refusal to accept that 12,000 people would die if they could prevent it. The rescue operation took 6 days. Human engineers improvised solutions using equipment that wasn't designed for the purpose. Human miners worked in shifts around the clock, digging through collapsed tunnels with basic tools when their machinery failed. Human doctors treated injuries with limited supplies, while human pilots ferried the rescued to safety in ships that were never meant for emergency evacuation. In the end, 11,847 beings were pulled from the wreckage alive. The cost to humanity had been enormous in terms of resources and risk, with no possibility of compensation or benefit. They had done it because it was the right thing to do. The Kepler sector contains 17 worlds, Sarah continued, her presentation shifting to show detailed surveys of each planet. Worlds that could become homes for millions of beings. The question is not who has the power to take control of these worlds, but who has the commitment to help them reach their potential. The human proposal was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of traditional colonial administration, they suggested a cooperative development model. Each world would be settled by volunteers from multiple species, with humans providing logistical support and infrastructure development. Scientific discoveries would be shared freely. Trade would operate on fair terms with transparent pricing. Military protection would be provided not through intimidation, but through a genuine commitment to defend peaceful beings from aggression. The audience listened in stunned silence. This was not how galactic politics worked. Territories were claimed through strength, maintained through force, and exploited for the benefit of the ruling species. The idea of voluntary cooperation and shared benefit was so alien to their experience that many representatives seemed unable to process what they were hearing. As Sarah concluded her presentation and returned to her seat, the silence stretched on uncomfortably long. Finally, the Vorthak ambassador rose to his feet, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber. "Humans," he said, his translator rendering his words in tones of condescending amusement. "Your optimism is charming. But this is not a charity organization. This is about real power in the real galaxy. Perhaps you should observe a few more cycles before attempting to play with civilizations that have existed since before your species discovered fire." Laughter rippled through the chamber, though Sarah noticed it was not universal. Several delegations remained silent, their expressions thoughtful rather than amused. The representative from the Altaran Republic, a species known for their philosophical approach to governance, was taking notes. The ambassador from the Helix Confederation, survivors of a recent war that had devastated their homeworld, watched the human delegation with obvious interest. The voting would take place in 3 days, giving delegations time to consider their options and engage in the traditional behind-the-scenes negotiations that really determined outcomes. Sarah knew that humanity had no chance in the formal vote. They lacked the political influence, economic leverage, or military threat needed to sway the major powers. But as the delegations dispersed and the humans made their way back to their modest quarters, Sarah noticed something that gave her hope. They were no longer being ignored. Conversations stopped when they passed. Aliens who had previously looked through them as if they didn't exist now watched their movements with curious eyes. The laughter had died away, replaced by something more complex. That evening, as Sarah reviewed their presentation materials and prepared for the inevitable rejection, her door chime sounded. She opened it to find Ambassador Kresh of the Altaran Republic standing in the corridor, his tall, gray-skinned frame draped in the simple robes his species favored. "Ambassador Chen," he said, his voice carrying the musical quality typical of his people. "I wonder if you might have time for a conversation. I find myself curious about certain aspects of your proposal." As Sarah invited him in, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 day. They had come to the conference as a joke, a source of amusement for their betters. But perhaps, just perhaps, they had planted a seed that would grow into something larger. The real competition was just beginning, and humanity was about to discover that their greatest strength was not their technology or their military might, but their ability to make others believe in possibilities they had never considered before. Ambassador Kresh settled into the modest chair across from Sarah. His elongated fingers, steepled in a gesture she had learned, indicated deep thought among his species. The Altaran Republic was old, even by galactic standards, their civilization having achieved spaceflight when humanity was still struggling with agriculture. Yet here he was, in their cramped quarters, asking questions about humanity's vision for the Kepler sector. "Your presentation today was most unusual," Kresh began, his melodic voice carefully modulated. "In 3,000 years of council proceedings, I have never heard a territorial claim based on moral obligation rather than capability." Sarah poured 2 cups of earth tea, one of the few luxuries their delegation had brought. "We've found that capability without purpose tends to create more problems than it solves. The strongest civilizations in galactic history seem to have spent most of their energy fighting each other." Kresh accepted the tea with graceful courtesy, though she wasn't sure his physiology could process it. Indeed, the hegemony wars, the crystalline convergence, the great silence, each conflict arose from species who believed their strength gave them the right to reshape the galaxy according to their vision. Over the next 2 hours, their conversation ranged across topics Sarah had never expected to discuss with an alien diplomat. Philosophy, ethics, the nature of civilization itself. Kresh spoke of his people's long history, of the cycles of expansion and collapse they had witnessed, of the growing sense among older species that perhaps there were better ways to organize galactic society. "The current system benefits the strong at the expense of the weak," he said quietly. "But strength is temporary. The Vorthak Empire seems invincible now, but so did the Korath Dominion before their sun went nova. So did the Machine Collective before their central intelligence fragmented. Power structures built on dominance eventually collapse under their own weight." When Kresh finally left, well past the station's artificial midnight, Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic. If they could convince even a few delegations to support their proposal, it might force a real debate about the future of galactic governance. She was naive enough to believe that sometimes the right argument presented at the right moment could change everything. The next morning brought the first surprise. Ambassador Yenth of the Helix Confederation requested a formal meeting with the human delegation. The Helix species had been devastated by a recent war with the Machina swarm, their homeworld stripped bare and their population reduced to a few million survivors scattered across temporary settlements. They had almost no political influence and were generally ignored by the major powers. "We have studied your proposal carefully," Yenth said, her scarred carapace telling the story of someone who had fought in the final battles for her world. "The cooperative development model you describe, it resembles something our philosophers wrote about centuries ago before we became caught up in the game of territorial expansion." Commander Torres leaned forward, his interest evident. "What happened to those ideas?" "Reality," Yenth replied with what might have been bitter laughter. "We encountered the Vorthak Empire and learned that idealism was a luxury we could not afford. We built weapons instead of schools, warships instead of hospitals. We became very good at war, so good that we attracted the attention of the swarm. Now we are few, and our weapons could not save us." The meeting stretched through the day as they discussed practical details of humanity's proposal. How would resource disputes be resolved? What mechanisms would prevent one species from dominating others? How would security be maintained without creating a military hierarchy? The questions were complex, but Sarah was struck by how engaged Yenth became as they worked through potential solutions. By evening, They had the framework for something unprecedented, a formal alliance between humanity and the Helix Confederation, two of the weakest delegations at the conference, supporting a radically different approach to territorial administration. It was symbolic rather than practical. Neither species had the power to influence the final vote, but it sent a message that alternatives to the traditional power structure were being seriously considered. Word of the alliance spread quickly through the station's gossip networks. By the next morning, the human delegation found themselves receiving visitors from species they had never heard of. The Quillen Collective, a hive mind that had been systematically excluded from territorial rights because their consensus-based decision-making was considered too slow for galactic politics. The Nomad Fleets, wandering traders who had no permanent settlements but transported goods and information across vast distances. The Synthesis Coalition, former slaves who had won their freedom but remained pariahs among civilizations that still practiced forced labor. Each group brought their own perspectives and concerns, but they shared a common thread: dissatisfaction with a galactic order that concentrated power among a handful of aggressive expansionist civilizations. The humans found themselves at the center of something they had never intended to create. An informal coalition of the excluded and marginalized, united by a vision of cooperation replacing domination. The major powers took notice. Ambassador Threx of the Vorthak Empire arrived at the human quarters unannounced, his massive frame requiring the corridor to be cleared of other traffic. His entourage of lesser Vorthak officers flanked him like a military formation, their ceremonial weapons prominently displayed. The message was clear. This was not a social call. "Human Ambassador Chen," Threx rumbled, his translator struggling with the deep bass frequencies of his voice. "I understand you have been having many interesting conversations with various minor species." Sarah stood her ground, though the Vorthak's physical presence was intimidating. He was nearly 3 meters tall, his reptilian features scarred from what were clearly combat wounds, his dark scales reflecting the corridor lighting like polished obsidian. "We've been discussing our proposal for cooperative development of the Kepler sector. I believe such discussions are permitted under Council protocols." "Of course," Threx replied, though his tone suggested anything but agreement. "However, I thought it might be wise to clarify certain realities that may not be apparent to such a young species. The galaxy operates according to certain principles that have been established over millennia. Species that attempt to disrupt these principles often find themselves facing difficulties." The threat was delicately phrased but unmistakable. Commander Torres shifted slightly, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sidearm, a gesture that would have been laughable if not for the courage it represented. A human pistol against Vorthak battle armor was like a sharp stick against a tank. "The Vorthak Empire has always valued strength," Sarah replied carefully. "But we've found that true strength often lies in unexpected places. The ability to inspire others, to build consensus, to create something larger than oneself. These can be more powerful than any weapon." Threx studied her for a long moment, his reptilian eyes unreadable. "You believe this, don't you? You actually believe that your tiny coalition of failures and outcasts can challenge the established order?" "I believe that change is inevitable," Sarah said. "The question is whether it happens gradually through cooperation or catastrophically through conflict. History suggests that empires built on pure dominance eventually face challenges they cannot overcome through force alone." The Vorthak ambassador was quiet for several heartbeats. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly, carrying what might have been respect alongside the menace. "You have courage, human. Misguided courage, but courage nonetheless. I hope for your sake that it does not lead you to make choices you will regret." After the Vorthak delegation departed, leaving the corridor feeling somehow larger and brighter, Torres turned to Sarah with a grim expression. That was a declaration of war, wasn't it? No, Sarah replied thoughtfully. That was a test. He wanted to see if we would back down when confronted directly. The fact that we didn't has probably earned us a certain amount of respect, even if he still considers us naive. The final day before the vote brought a series of private meetings with representatives from civilizations that remained officially uncommitted. The Symmetry Consortium, a collection of mathematical purists who governed through algorithmic consensus, expressed interest in the cooperative model's logical consistency. The Garden Worlds Alliance, agricultural planets that supplied food to much of the galaxy, saw potential benefits in the fair trade aspects of humanity's proposal. Even some members of the Ethereal Collective, despite their reputation for aloof superiority, seemed intrigued by the philosophical implications. None of these species had enough influence to determine the outcome, but their support would carry symbolic weight. More importantly, they represented a growing recognition that the current system might not be sustainable in the long term. The evening before the vote, Sarah stood at the observation deck looking out at the assembled fleets. The Vorthak dreadnoughts remained in their perfect formation, weapons systems powered down but clearly ready for instant activation. The ethereal vessels continued their strange dance between dimensions, their forms shifting and blurring against the star field. The Zephyrian trade fleet sparkled with elegant efficiency, each ship a masterpiece of form and function. And there, almost lost among the Titans, hung humanity's modest contribution to the gathering. 15 ships that looked like converted cargo haulers because that's largely what they were. No exotic technology, no overwhelming firepower, no displays of impossible physics. Just functional vessels built by a species that was still learning how to reach for the stars. Commander Torres joined her at the observation window, his expression thoughtful. Do you really think we have a chance tomorrow? Not in the formal vote, Sarah admitted. The numbers just aren't there. But I think we've already achieved something more important. We've started a conversation that will continue long after we return to Earth. As if to prove her point, the communication system chimed with an incoming message. The sender was unexpected. Ambassador Xel of the Ethereal Collective, one of the most influential beings in the galaxy. Ambassador Chen, the message began, the words appearing as glowing text rather than audio due to the ethereal's non-physical nature. Your species has presented interesting concepts that warrant further discussion. I would like to extend an invitation for continued dialogue following the conclusion of these proceedings. There are possibilities your people have not yet considered. Sarah showed the message to Torres, who whistled softly. Even if we lose the vote, we've got their attention. That's more than anyone expected when we came here. The vote was scheduled for the following afternoon, but Sarah found herself wondering if the real decision had already been made in the countless conversations, negotiations, and subtle confrontations that had filled the past few days. Humanity had come to the conference as a joke, an amusing sideshow for the entertainment of their betters. But they had discovered something that might prove more valuable than territory or resources. The power to make others question assumptions they had never thought to examine. Tomorrow would bring the formal conclusion to the Dominion Selection Conference. But Sarah was beginning to suspect that for humanity, and for the galaxy itself, this was just the beginning. The amphitheater buzzed with anticipation as delegates filed in for the final vote. Sarah noticed that the seating arrangements had shifted subtly from the opening ceremonies. Species that had previously clustered with their traditional allies now sat in new configurations. The Quillen Collective had positioned themselves near the human delegation. Several members of the Garden Worlds Alliance occupied seats that gave them clear sightlines to both the humans and the Altaran Republic. Even some of the smaller Zephyrian trade guilds had moved away from their Federation's main block. The voting process itself was ceremonial theater. Everyone knew the outcome would be decided by the three major powers, with smaller species falling in line according to their political and economic dependencies. The Vorthak Empire would vote for themselves. The Ethereal Collective would support their own bid. The Zephyrian Trade Federation would do the same. The question was, which of these titans could gather enough secondary support to claim victory? Council Speaker Mordain, an ancient being whose species had died out millennia ago but whose consciousness persisted in crystalline form, called the session to order. His voice resonated through the chamber with harmonics that bypassed the translation matrix, speaking directly to the auditory centers of every brain present. Honored delegates, we gather to determine stewardship of the Kepler sector according to the ancient protocols. Each candidate civilization will make their final statement before the vote is taken. The Vorthak ambassador rose first, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber floor. His statement was brief and direct. Strength brought order, order brought peace, and peace allowed civilization to flourish. The Vorthak Empire had the military might to protect the Kepler sector from any threat while developing its resources efficiently. Opposition would be met with overwhelming force. Cooperation would be rewarded with protection and prosperity. The Ethereal Collective's representatives shimmered into a more solid form, their statement delivered through complex mathematical equations that appeared as floating symbols in the air. They spoke of guiding lesser species toward enlightenment, of bringing order to chaos through superior wisdom and technology. The Kepler sector would become a laboratory for advancing galactic civilization under their careful stewardship. The Zephyrian ambassador's presentation was a masterwork of economic projections and trade route optimization. They demonstrated how the sector could be developed into a commercial hub that would benefit the entire galaxy through job creation, technological advancement, and profit-sharing agreements. Their vast trade networks would ensure efficient distribution of resources and opportunities. When Sarah's turn came, the chamber fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, not to hear what humanity would say, but to witness what would surely be the most elaborate concession speech in galactic history. Sarah walked to the speaker's platform with quiet confidence, her simple uniform a stark contrast to the exotic regalia worn by other ambassadors. She carried no notes, no holographic displays, no technological aids beyond a small recording device. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. 3 days ago, humanity came before you with a proposal that many found amusing. We suggested that strength should be measured not by the ability to take, but by the capacity to give. We proposed that true security comes not from the threat of force, but from the knowledge that all beings within a territory have a stake in its success. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled delegates. Today, I want to share something that happened while we've been debating these concepts. The recording device projected a holographic display that showed a small transport ship, clearly human in origin but flying under distress signals. The timestamp indicated the recording was less than 6 hours old. The merchant vessel Phoenix suffered a catastrophic drive failure 2 systems from here. 47 crew members of various species were stranded with life support failing and no possibility of rescue by conventional means. The recording showed the Phoenix drifting powerless in space, its hull breached in several places, debris field indicating significant internal damage. Standard galactic protocols would have classified this as a total loss. The cost of mounting a rescue operation would far exceed the value of the ship and crew. At 0800 this morning, ships from 17 different species responded to the Phoenix's distress call, not because they were ordered to, not because they expected payment, but because they had been inspired by an idea we had been discussing here at this conference. The display shifted to show the rescue operation. Vorthak shuttles, their military efficiency adapted to evacuation procedures. Ethereal vessels phasing through the Phoenix's damaged hull to reach trapped crew members. Zephyrian medical ships providing advanced treatment facilities. Quillen collective drones working in perfect coordination to stabilize the failing life support systems. Garden World agricultural ships supplying emergency food and medical supplies. The rescue was completed in 4 hours. 46 crew members were saved. Sarah's voice caught slightly on the number. We lost one being, a Helix engineer who stayed behind to manually override a radiation containment system that would have killed a dozen others if it had failed. The chamber was completely silent now. The holographic display showed the rescued crew members being transferred to medical facilities, beings of different species working together with a coordination that defied traditional diplomatic boundaries. Her name was Kenth Parr, Sarah continued, now speaking directly to Ambassador Yenth of the Helix Confederation. She was 26 years old by human reckoning. She had never seen her home world. She was born in one of the refugee settlements after the Swarm Wars. But she understood something that we've been trying to explain here for 3 days, that true strength comes from the willingness to sacrifice for others. Ambassador Yenth's scarred carapace seemed to dim, her head bowed in what Sarah recognized as a gesture of profound grief and pride among her species. The rescue operation succeeded because 17 different civilizations chose to work together instead of competing. They shared resources, coordinated their technologies, and subordinated their individual interests to a common goal. They proved that our proposal for the Kepler sector isn't naive idealism, it's a practical necessity. Sarah touched the recording device again, and the display shifted to show communication logs from the rescue operation. Species that had been bitter enemies cooperating without hesitation. Military commanders taking orders from civilian engineers because they had the expertise needed for the situation. Economic rivals sharing expensive emergency equipment without contracts or guarantees of repayment. The Phoenix rescue wasn't planned or organized by any central authority. It happened because individual beings from different civilizations chose to act according to principles of cooperation and mutual aid. It showed us what the galaxy could become if we stopped thinking of territory as something to be conquered and started thinking of it as something to be stewarded. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Sarah returned to her delegation's seating area. She had played their final card, though she wasn't sure if it would be enough to change any minds. The formal voting would proceed according to established protocols, but the real decision might have been made in the past 4 hours as 17 different species demonstrated humanity's vision in action. Council Speaker Mordain called for the vote to begin. The process was ancient and ritualized. Each delegation would announce their choice in order of their civilization's age, with the oldest species voting first. The Ethereal Collective voted for themselves, as expected. The Altaran Republic surprised many by voting for humanity's cooperative proposal rather than one of the major powers. The Vorthak Empire voted for themselves with obvious confidence. The Zephyrian Trade Federation supported their own bid. But as the voting continued, patterns emerged that defied traditional expectations. The Quillen Collective voted for humanity. So did the Helix Confederation. The Garden Worlds Alliance cast their votes for the cooperative proposal. The nomad fleets, who rarely participated in territorial disputes, formally endorsed humanity's vision for the first time in recorded council history. More surprising were the votes from species that had traditional alliances with the major powers. Several Zephyrian trade guilds broke with their federation to support the human proposal. A faction within the Ethereal Collective announced they were abstaining rather than supporting their own government's bid. Even some client species of the Vorthak Empire cast unexpected votes. When the tally was announced, the result sent shockwaves through the chamber. No single power had achieved the majority needed for territorial control. The Vorthak Empire and Zephyrian Trade Federation were tied for the most votes among traditional candidates, but humanity's cooperative proposal had received the support of 43 different species, not enough to win, but enough to prevent any other faction from claiming victory. Council Speaker Mordane's crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated deep confusion. The protocols do not account for this situation. No candidate has achieved the required majority, yet the voting rules have been followed correctly. Ambassador Threx of the Vorthak Empire rose to his full, intimidating height, his voice carrying undertones of barely controlled anger. This is unprecedented. The Council must decide between legitimate claimants, not waste time on proposals that cannot be implemented. But Ambassador Xel of the Ethereal Collective surprised everyone by disagreeing. The voting was conducted according to established protocols. The result, while unexpected, is valid. Perhaps this situation indicates that our traditional approach to territorial administration requires reconsideration. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Some delegates argued for a second vote excluding the human proposal. Others suggested dividing the Kepler sector among the major powers. A few radical voices proposed accepting the vote results as a mandate for trying something completely new. During a recess, Sarah found herself surrounded by delegates from the species that had supported humanity's proposal. They were an odd coalition, ancient civilizations tired of endless conflict, young species excluded from traditional power structures, and pragmatists who saw cooperation as more efficient than competition. "What happens now?" asked Ambassador Kresh of the Alteran Republic. Sarah had been wondering the same thing. Humanity's proposal had received more support than anyone expected, but it hadn't achieved a clear mandate. They were in uncharted territory, both politically and practically. "We keep talking," she said finally. "We've proven that there's appetite for a different approach to galactic governance. Maybe that's more important than controlling one sector of space." When the session reconvened, Council Speaker Mordane announced an unprecedented decision. The Kepler sector would be administered under a provisional cooperative agreement, with humanity serving as lead coordinators, but with governing councils including representatives from all supporting species. The arrangement would be reviewed after a 10-year trial period. It wasn't complete victory, but it was something entirely new in galactic politics. As delegates filed out of the chamber, many stopped to speak with the human delegation. Some offered congratulations, others promised continuing cooperation, and a few expressed cautious hope that perhaps the galaxy was ready to try something different. Standing at the observation deck one final time before departure, Sarah watched as the various fleets began their journeys home. But something had changed in their formations. Ships from different civilizations traveled together in mixed groups, continuing conversations that had started during the rescue of the Phoenix. Trade vessels shared escort duties with military craft. Scientific expeditions included participants from multiple species. Commander Torres joined her at the window, his expression thoughtful. "Think this will actually work? The cooperative development thing, I mean." "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I think we've started something that will outlast any single territorial decision. We've shown that cooperation is possible even between species that have been enemies for centuries. Maybe that's worth more than controlling a few star systems." The human transport vessel departed the station 12 hours later, carrying a delegation that had arrived as a joke and left as pioneers of a new approach to galactic civilization. Behind them, in meeting rooms and communication channels throughout the station, representatives from dozens of species continued the conversations that would shape the next phase of galactic history. Humanity had been invited to the conference as entertainment for their betters. They had ended up changing the rules of the game entirely. The galaxy would never be quite the same, and perhaps that was exactly what it needed.